Um, how does a military apparatus mask the loss of an entire generation of combat power? Well, I mean, they issue a press release. Welcome to the Midget 47 podcast.
Yeah.
And for today's deep dive into our reporting, we're starting with a fundamental math problem. We're looking at the facts on the ground in Ukraine as of May 2026.
Right, and what we've uncovered at the news desk is just a really stark, lethal disconnect.
Yeah, there is this immense gap between Russia's geopolitical PR and, the actual reality of its collapsing military manpower. Like, usually when you talk about a military front, you expect basic clarity here.
Sure, you assume public declarations reflect at least some sort of reality in the trenches.
But our reporting shows that the gap between what's broadcast to the U.S. press and what's actually happening in the mud has become a complete chasm.
It's a deliberate chasm, too, because as we've been tracking the data over the last 6 months, we are seeing two converging stories that they do not align at all.
Yes, even a little bit.
No. On one hand, Moscow is pushing this highly publicized so-called Victory Day ceasefire. And on the other hand, our data desks have confirmed 5 straight months of net negative troop replacement.
Which is basically bleeding the Russian military dry from the inside out. So I want to look at the timeline here, because as our team compiled this data, the lethal contradiction just became impossible to ignore.
Right. Let's start with the PR narrative that dominated the news cycle.
Yeah, so Russia unilaterally declared a ceasefire for May 8th and 9th, time for its annual Victory Day commemorations. And we need to be clear about the factual setup of where this sudden diplomatic push came from.
Our reporting confirms this ceasefire proposal originated in a phone call between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump.
Right. Trump's team has been pushing a de-escalation framework, and Russia took that framework and used it to generate favorable headlines tailored specifically for a U.S. audience.
Which is, it's highly cynical geopolitical maneuvering. A functioning ceasefire is typically a bilateral agreement, right?
Yeah, it takes intense logistical negotiation between the actual warring parties.
But here, the Kremlin completely bypassed the country they are actually fighting. They just aimed a press release directly at Western media consumers to project this image of measured diplomacy.
But the ground truth, the reality our data teams are tracking hour by hour, tells a horrific story.
It really does.
On May 4th, just days before the supposed truce was meant to take effect, at 09:35 local time, a Russian Iskander precision ballistic missile hit Marefa.
Wow.
Yeah. It's a civilian suburb of Kharkiv, about 30 kilometers from the Russian border.
Yeah.
Which, puts it well behind the active front line.
And our reporting confirms 7 people dead and 35 wounded.
Yeah. And the destruction is entirely civilian infrastructure. 10 houses, an administrative building, 4 shops, a car repair workshop, and a food establishment. All of it just wiped off the map.
Oh, man. The community had to declare a 3-day period of mourning. And we really need to pause and look at the actual munition used in that strike, because it speaks to the intent.
The Iskander, right?
Yeah. An Iskander is not some stray artillery shell that just drifted off target. It is a highly advanced, multi-million-dollar precision ballistic weapon.
So firing that into a civilian suburb far behind the front line, while simultaneously promoting de-escalation to the U.S., is a calculated demonstration.
Precisely. It's a strategy of projecting power through terror locally, while projecting peace through diplomacy globally.
And Ukraine's leadership was entirely left out of this supposed peace. President Volodymyr Zelensky's office provided a harsh reality check to our reporters.
Ukraine was never officially notified of this May 8th and 9th ceasefire. There was no invitation to join.
But here is where the narrative completely fractures. The Kremlin paired this public declaration of a truce with an explicit threat.
Right.
They stated publicly they would launch massive missile strikes on central Kyiv if any Victory Day events in Moscow were disrupted.
That detail is the architectural flaw in the entire Russian narrative.
Wait, hold on. I have to stop you there because the very concept makes no sense.
Yeah.
If a supposed truce is paired with an explicit preemptive threat to bomb a capital city, is it functioning as a ceasefire at all? Or is it fundamentally just a hostage negotiation tactic designed for American headlines?
Oh, it is absolutely a hostage tactic. A genuine ceasefire requires mutual operational stand-downs and deconfliction lines.
For anyone listening who hasn't been tracking the day-to-day logistics of military negotiations, what does a deconfliction line actually mean on the ground?
It means verified communication channels between opposing commanders to ensure no one fires by mistake. It means mapping out precise zones where troops spill back.
You don't just yell pause on a battlefield spanning hundreds of miles.
Right. It requires massive logistical coordination. When you threaten a capital city while declaring a halt to hostilities, you aren't offering peace. You are holding a gun to the head of the civilian population.
Demanding silence so your parade can proceed.
Without the awkward interruption of the war you started, yeah.
And Zelensky called them on it. He countered by calling their 48-hour pause meaningless and proposed a genuine 30-day comprehensive ceasefire tied to real negotiations.
The distinction our reporting highlights here is vital. A 30-day pause actually creates operational space for humanitarian corridors and real diplomatic progress.
Whereas a 48-hour pause just creates a Sunday morning talk show talking point.
We have a clear historical precedent for this pattern, too. Look back at the Orthodox Easter period. Russia announced a very similar unilateral pause.
And our data from that window shows over 400 documented Russian violations of their own declared ceasefire.
If you want the clearest assessment, you only need to look at the reporting from the Kyiv Independent, quoting Ukrainian soldiers in the trenches. They summarized the Orthodox Easter truce in 4 words. The front is noisy.
Missiles don't observe holidays, so we have to connect these two realities for you. Why is Russia relying on artificial 48-hour PR pauses pitched to the U.S.?
Why the sudden, desperate need for favorable headlines about de-escalation?
Because when we transition from the press releases to the hard data our team compiled from United 24 Media, the picture changes entirely.
Beneath the surface, the Russian military is structurally collapsing, and they desperately need to slow down the battlefield attrition.
The mathematics of their manpower deficit are just, frankly, staggering.
We're looking at numbers verified by Ukrainian defense officials that show a 5-month deficit. For 5 consecutive months, from December 2025 through April 2026, Russia has lost more troops than it can replace.
They are operating in a severe net negative manpower deficit. I want to visualize what net negative actually looks like on the ground because the numbers we verified are hard to wrap your head around.
In just a single month, March 2026 personnel losses hit a record 35,351 troops killed or wounded.
Let that sink in. Across that entire 5-month window, Ukraine inflicted at least 156,735 Russian personnel losses.
We're talking about the complete elimination of combat power equivalent to multiple modern armies erased in the span of a single winter and spring.
And you can't just look at the casualties in a vacuum, right?
No, military sustainability is a fraction. It is casualties over replacements. In the first quarter of 2026, Russia's recruitment pace was hovering around 940 troops per day.
Which sounds like a lot, until you project that out against the sheer velocity of their losses. You're looking at an annual shortfall of over 65,000 soldiers.
The countermeasures they are attempting just highlight the desperation of a failing system.
Our reporting tracks how Moscow has doubled signing bonuses since 2024 to try and incentivize enlistment.
They've resorted to recruiting directly from prisons. They are drafting older men who fall far outside standard military age.
And despite all of this frantic patching of the holes, Western defense analysts estimate that Russia's effective combat pool has shrunk by 25% since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022.
Wait, I want to dig into that specific point about drafting older men and pulling from penal colonies.
Yeah, from a strictly operational standpoint, what does that do to a military unit? You aren't just swapping one human for another, right?
No, you are degrading the entire unit's operational capacity. Modern warfare requires intense physical load-bearing and rapid reaction times.
And deep technical proficiency.
Right, so when you replace an experienced, physically fit 25-year-old veteran with a 50-year-old pushed through abbreviated basic training, the whole squad has to slow down.
The tactical flexibility of the unit collapses.
It creates a cascading structural failure. The veterans have to overcompensate, which leads to higher fatigue.
Which then leads to higher casualty rates among the few capable soldiers you have left. But looking at this data, I have to ask a broader question about military history.
Sure.
Russia started this war with overwhelming numerical superiority. If they are still managing to recruit over 900 men a day, the issue isn't just a lack of bodies. It's the sheer velocity at which they are being eliminated.
That is the core strategic question of this entire conflict. What is fundamentally breaking their historical military doctrine of mass infantry?
And the answer lies in a highly specific asymmetric technological advantage.
It's Ukraine's drone strategy. It is not conventional artillery duels or tank battles driving this unsustainable casualty rate.
It is the systematic, relentless application of drone warfare.
Let's break down the data from April 2026 on this because it is wild.
Our reporting shows that Ukraine's drone units alone were responsible for 31.15% of all Russian personnel losses.
That is 10,581 troops eliminated in a single month by drones alone.
The asymmetry here is profound. Finnish President Alexander Stubb recently stated that Russia is suffering 4 times the casualties Ukraine is suffering.
A 4-to-1 ratio. In a war of attrition, a 4-to-1 ratio driven by unmanned aerial vehicles is catastrophic for the side relying on human waves.
I want to spend some time on the how here. We throw around the term drone warfare, but what does that actually look like operationally for the infantrymen on the ground?
How does a piece of plastic with propellers cause a structural collapse of a global superpower's military?
Right.
We are primarily talking about FPV, or first-person view, drones. Picture a pilot sitting miles away in a trench or a reinforced bunker wearing a VR headset.
They are flying a highly maneuverable, cheap commercial quadcopter that's been modified to carry an explosive payload, like a rocket-propelled grenade warhead.
They aren't just dropping bombs from high altitudes. They are flying these drones directly through the open hatches of armored vehicles or straight into infantry groupings.
And we also hear a lot about loitering munitions in our reporting. For anyone who hasn't been tracking the day-to-day tech advancements, what is the difference?
We're basically talking about kamikaze drones that hover in the sky until they find a target, right?
Spot on. A loitering munition is launched without specific target coordinates. It flies to a general area and loiters in the sky using cameras and sensors.
And when it spots a target of opportunity, like a supply truck or a radar system, it dives and detonates.
Let's talk about the economics of that battlefield, because that's where this drone strategy becomes a lethal math problem for Moscow.
Ukraine is fielding these drones at an incredibly low cost. We're talking about a few $100 to a few $1,000s per unit.
And you have to contrast that with the target they are neutralizing. A $500 FPV drone piloted by a 20-year-old can destroy a T-90 tank that costs upwards of $4 million.
But it is not just the equipment. It is neutralizing infantry formations that cost immense resources to recruit, train, equip, and supply to the front lines.
So if I'm a Russian commander operating under traditional doctrine, my instinct is to push forward with overwhelming numbers. Mass overmaneuver.
And that is why they're failing. When the enemy has real-time, persistent overhead surveillance combined with cheap, precision-guided explosives, mass becomes your biggest vulnerability.
A concentration of troops is no longer an overwhelming, unstoppable force. It is simply a target-rich environment.
The sky is constantly buzzing. You can't mass armor it because it's spotted and destroyed before it reaches the line of contact.
You can't mass infantry because a swarm of 10 cheap drones will wipe out a platoon before they even fire a rifle.
And there is no strategic counter coming from Moscow. We are seeing month after month of systematic elimination.
Which brings us to the strategic end goal for Ukraine's military leadership. They have publicly stated that their aim is to sustain this brutal attrition rate straight through 2026.
The objective isn't necessarily to reclaim every inch of territory through massive, sweeping counteroffensives tomorrow.
No, the objective is to force the math to run out. War is ultimately a contest of resources and political will.
Ukraine is methodically destroying the resource half of that equation for Russia. By maintaining this net negative manpower deficit, they are accelerating a systemic crisis within the Russian military apparatus.
It is engineering a structural collapse.
Yes, the goal is to reach a mathematical tipping point. Eventually, you just don't have enough men to hold the line, let alone advance.
And when that structural failure happens, negotiated terms become significantly more palatable for Moscow than facing a total, uncontrolled collapse of their armed forces.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, when you are digesting the daily news cycle?
It means you have to look past the press releases.
When a foreign government, especially one actively engaged in hostilities, announces a truce to the American press, you have to look at the underlying data.
The gap between a declared Victory Day ceasefire and the reality of a 4-to-1 casualty ratio driven by explosive drones is where the actual war is being decided.
The real story isn't the 48-hour photo op. The real story is the 156,000 casualties over 5 months.
And we must remember the human cost of that gap between PR and reality. 7 people in Mariupol died in that gap.
The strategy of projecting strength while masking a structural collapse requires absolute ironclad control over information.
As long as the Kremlin can keep the narrative focused on ceremonial pauses, they can attempt to delay the consequences of their battlefield reality.
But mathematics is entirely indifferent to propaganda. A deficit of 65,000 troops a year cannot be hidden forever. Eventually, the missing men are noticed.
Which leaves us with a critical question to consider as the reporting continues to unfold. If a state's military is operating at a net negative manpower deficit for half a year, losing tens of thousands of men a month, while its leadership prioritizes 48-hour photo-op ceasefires, what happens when the domestic Russian population realizes the true scale of the mathematical deficit?
How long until the reality of those 156,000 casualties breaks through the state media firewall?
Support our independent accountability journalism. Visit impeach47.earth and follow us on Substack, X, Instagram, Threads, and YouTube at @impeach47.